after Paula filed that report, the United States has officially confirmed that it believes that was indeed an ICBM test. Now, Bruce Klingner of the Conservative Heritage Foundation has spent 20 years analyzing the region for the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency, and he recently was part of a small team that held a rare meeting with North Korean diplomats on neutral ground in Sweden. Mr. Klingner, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So, given that, you know, you've had your meetings with the North Koreans, I'll get you to tell me what they told you about all of this in a moment, but is this the red line that everybody's talking about?
Well, people have defined red lines differently, and some have advocated that there be a military strike to prevent North Korea from completing development of an ICBM, but that kind of strike would escalate the likelihood, or at least the potential, of an all-out war on the peninsula. Mm-hmm. So, you know, but it is a very startling development. Very worrisome, because even though this missile is estimated that it could have flown 5,700 kilometers or 6,700 kilometers, it could have perhaps gone even further. North Korea, as it has done recently, has constrained the trajectory so that it doesn't fly over Japan by flying it to a very high altitude. But had it gone to a normal range, it could have been 6,700 kilometers, all of Alaska, but perhaps even further.
Well, let me play you two assessments from weapons experts who spoke to CNN earlier today. There's Melissa Hannum and David Wright, as I say, speaking to CNN earlier. This is what they're saying about it.
Technically, that is an ICBM. It doesn't mean, of course, it has the capability to reach the lower 48 states, which is sort of 8,000 to 9,000 kilometers. But still, it has done what North Korea claimed to have done, which is, as far as I can tell, launch an ICBM.
No, we don't know whether they have a warhead that fits on a missile, but it's to the point where I think we probably have to start behaving from a policy standpoint as though they do. Simply because it's too risky not to.
Well, Mr. Klingner, you know, this has sort of escalated beyond people's imaginations. Do you believe, you heard what Melissa said, that we have to treat it as policy, that they could apply a warhead to these missiles? What do you think from your previous analysis?
Well, exactly. Both the analysts are superb and extremely well qualified. You know, we're trying to do our best assessment of what North Korea has, given limited information, and that's both from the outside as well as back in the intelligence community. But we've had 4 U.S. 4-star generals who say they either think North Korea already has the capability to hit the continental U.S. with a nuclear warhead, or they have to assume for planning purposes. Mm-hmm. North Korea previously tested a missile called the Unhads from a fixed launch site, and the South Korean Navy dredged up those stages and estimates that it could have a 10,000 or 13,000 kilometer range. That's either half of the continental U.S. or the entire continental U.S. This system today is a road mobile, and based on previous assessments of photos of a static rocket engine test, outside experts think that it could be able to range New York or Washington. So we may not know exactly where they are on the path of development, but we certainly know what their objective is, which is to be able to threaten the continental U.S. with a nuclear warhead. Mm-hmm.
So that's for their objective. What about for President Trump's reactions? You know, a few weeks or months ago, he said that North Korea would never have an ICBM. It will not happen. And then after this launch, he's tweeted, North Korea has just launched another missile. Does this guy have anything better to do with his life? Hard to believe that South Korea and Japan will put up with this much longer. Perhaps China will put a heavy move on North Korea and end this nonsense once and for all. So there are two questions there, obviously. What is a heavy move, first and foremost? What could China do?
Well, China could, for example, more fully implement required UN sanctions. They have been pulling their punches on that. They turn a blind eye to proliferation, which occurs on their soil. They turn a blind eye to North Korea's money laundering and illicit activity that's going through Chinese banks and businesses. And also, China could engage in the same kind of economic warfare that they've been pushing against South Korea for Seoul's decision to deploy the THAAD ballistic missile defense system. So there's a lot that China can do, that it should be doing. But also the U.S. has its own capabilities given the centrality of the U.S. dollar and the centrality of the U.S. financial system. The vast majority of all international transactions in the world, including those of North Korea, are denominated in dollars, which means they go through U.S. banks. So last week's sanction against the Bank of Dandong was the first time the U.S. had really taken action against a Chinese bank for the last 10 years. And there's evidence for a lot more Chinese entities that should be sanctioned.
But what happens when, the President of the United States, it just brings me to mind of Obama's red line in Syria. When the President of the United States says it will not happen, it won't happen, North Korea will not test an ICBM, and then a few weeks later it does, what are the realistic options to make the United States a serious deterrent, or to be serious about this?
Right. Well, there's no magic Rubik's Cube combination to solve the North Korean problem. It's something that has troubled successive U.S. administrations for decades, and we're going to be stuck with it for some time. We do need to make sure that we have sufficient defenses for ourselves and for our allies. That includes not only the conventional forces and the what's called the nuclear umbrella, but also ballistic missile defense. That would include deploying the THAAD tactical level system to South Korea, but also ensuring we have sufficient ground-based interceptors in Alaska and California. We have perhaps 44 now, and also reviewing the strategic missile defense systems that Obama put on hold or cut. So, but we also need to increase the pressure. Yes.
No, sorry. Does this keep you up at night? Are you concerned about these developments, particularly after having met with these North Korean diplomats? I mean, given what they said to you, so explain to me, did they give you any reassurances?
Absolutely not. They made very clear, very emphatically clear that denuclearization is totally off the table. There's nothing that the U.S. or Seoul could offer to induce them to abandon their nuclear arsenal. They became irritated when we tried various options of suggested things that would get them back to the negotiating table. They said, quite simply, accept us as a nuclear state, and then we're willing to either talk about a peace treaty or fight.
Wow, it doesn't look good. And, with the president seeming to put a lot of the onus on China, even though, by the way, China is getting angry with President Trump, for the sanctions he's imposed, etc., it doesn't look like there's a great relationship there. What do you think they can come up with at the G20? Because Russia and China today both said there should be a simultaneous freeze of North Korea's missile and nuclear program, and as you know, with the U.S. abandoning military exercises and perhaps even the THAAD missile system that you were talking about.
Right. China has always overpromised and underdelivered. President Xi promised Trump at the Mar-a-Lago summit that he would do more, and we've heard that song before, and we've always been disappointed. But again, the U.S. can do a lot of things against entities, including Chinese, that are violating U.S. law. The Bank of Dandong really is just the tip of the iceberg of Chinese entities that should be sanctioned. And we don't need Chinese permission for that, because we're protecting our financial system. We're protecting our banks from those that are misusing them. So, it's not overseas enforcement. It's enforcing our own laws in our own country. The freeze for freeze idea is not a good idea. It's North Korea offering something they don't legally possess, because they're not allowed to test under the UN resolutions, for U.S. and South Korean military exercises that we're allowed to do.
I mean, do you think that the West or other countries, well, yes, the United States is getting any closer to a preemptive military strike? And what would that look like?
Well, there has been growing advocacy in Washington and Seoul for such a strike. I think there's a bit too much flippancy in that I don't think people realize the consequences. Back when I was in government and we did war games or tabletop exercises, even before we thought North Korea had nuclear weapons, we always won. The alliance always won, but the casualties were in the hundreds of thousands, and it could be much higher now that they have nuclear weapons. So although we, of course, always have to respond to a North Korea tactical or strategic attack, and we always have to be there to deter such military action by the regime, we should not go quickly into a preventive strike because that would escalate into potentially an all-out war.
Pyongyang's July 4th surprise for the United States. Bruce Klingner, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Washington. And as America celebrates independence,